Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. This is Evidence in the Green, closing the cannabis research gap. I'm your co-host, LaKeysha Moton,
And I'm your other co-host, Arnelle Etienne.
and in this 5-episode podcast, we'll sit down with some of the cannabis industry's leading professionals, each a subject matter expert in their own respective fields.
Over the course of this 5-episode series, we will cover topics like federal and state regulations, optimal study design, how cannabis research can translate into changes in public policy, and much more. We hope you enjoy the show.
Okay, to get us started, we are joined by two esteemed policy researchers. We have Professor of Public Policy, Dr. Daniel Mallinson from Penn State University, Harrisburg, and political scientist, Dr. Hannah from Wright State University. Together, they co-authored the highly acclaimed book, Green Rush, The Rise of Medical Marijuana in the United States. And the book provides an analysis on how the states have navigated a path toward medical cannabis legalization amid federal prohibition. Their work has been featured in outlets like the Rockefeller Institute of Government, Newsweek, the New York Times, and NPR. Dr. Mallinson, Dr. Hannah, thank you both so much for joining us. I'll just jump right into it. We have a lot to cover. Can you guys kind of guide us through the regulatory agencies that govern these policies impacting cannabis research?
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you for having us. Yeah, where we are, there's a lot that has changed and a lot in many ways that hasn't. Of course, I think the big place to start with what hasn't changed is that cannabis is still a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substance Act with the federal government. And that has huge downstream implications on research that we'll, talk about today. It of course means that according to the federal government, cannabis has no medical value, and it's highly addictive, or has a highly addictive potential, and that has been questioned since the beginning, which is also something that we can talk about from our research. But that's where cannabis continues to stand federally. In terms of how that affects research, it's a very onerous process to be able to actually do research with cannabis. You have to actually receive a Schedule I license to be able to use the product for research, which is its own, not an easy process. But even after you get the license to be able to even do the research, there are strict regulatory approvals. There's approvals within the university. So a lot of this research is done at universities or at other research institutions, and they have their own institutional review boards, which have a tendency to be skittish with cannabis or with controlled substance research. So there's a lot of oversight and requirements there. Has to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, maybe approvals required by their states as well. And then there's all kinds of requirements that are needed for your physical lab space, which is something that we've written a little bit about, all the security, and keeping the stuff locked up and having all these security protocols so that other people can't access it. And that requires then a lot of institutional support from the universities. So it's a very strict process that requires a lot of support and a lot of financial support. And that's one of the other pieces then that makes this research really difficult is the financial part. There's been some research done on where federal money goes in terms of cannabis research, and most of it goes to research into the harms of cannabis.
Right.
Addiction, health effects, things like that. It does not primarily, or the majority of it does not go to research on, well, what are its potential therapeutic effects. So the research is hard, it costs a lot of money, and if you're looking at it for therapy, you're less likely to get that money that you need, right, from the federal government.
Wow.
So this whole sort of federal ecosystem is a challenge.
So knowing that, can you guys kind of discuss how the approach to medical cannabis policies has evolved at the state levels? Kind of what are the factors that have influenced this shift over time? Has public opinion shaped these state policies on medical cannabis?
Sure, yes. So I can start with that, and this is Lee, and I will just add that not only to do the medical clinical trials, you have to go through the federal government. The federal government has to touch that at the FDA level, the DEA level. Your state Department of Health normally has to oversee it, and so there are all of these checkpoints. And just as you kind of got the runaround from the DEA, that's not unheard of in this research field either, that researchers who do have a well-developed protocol, IRB approval, State Department of Health approval, are still stuck in this long cycle of trying to finally get the green light to do this research. And we'll probably circle back to this, but when they finally get the green light to do it, they're going to only be able to use some of the federally approved research product. And where the states are on how they've developed popular products that sell at the medical level and the recreational level, and where the federally funded suppliers are is miles apart. So even when you get to that and you have human subjects and they're using cannabis or they're using some type of placebo, you still have the potential that everything is for naught because it's such a different product than what they're actually using. And so that is where the states come in. And what we have seen, especially in medical, is public opinion has moved quickly on this area, and that has put more pressure on legislators to act, even in states where you wouldn't necessarily think that was a given. As they act, there is still a lot of framing about the harms and protecting people, and there has become more popular appeal to say we're going to study this as we move forward. And so a state like Pennsylvania, where Dan is, they have some medical cannabis research. I believe they have a center, and then several universities are affiliated. I believe that's how it works. New Mexico, similarly, and a handful of other states. I was just poking around to see what they've been able to do so far, and it seems like because of FDA, DEA, all the federal restrictions, normally what they're doing is observational research. So they're allowed to get a sample of people who are on the medical marijuana registry, and they're able to send them survey questions about the pros and cons of using cannabis. But that's a far cry from some type of study where half of a control group is just going about their daily lives, and then a treatment group is using some kind of tincture or vaporized product or whatever it may be. And so that's one of the things we see in the states is they're moving in that direction, but this is where they run up against the federal government, probably more than anywhere else.
You guys explored the concept of federalism in this context of cannabis legalization. Can you tell us, how do you see the interplay between state and federal policies affecting the future of medical cannabis here in the U.S.?
Yeah, sure. So a big thing that we talk about in the book is this idea that we've been working on for a few years. We call it defiant innovation. And so this is how this issue fits within federalism. So for those in the audience who maybe hear that term and don't know exactly what it means, in our federal system in the United States and in other federal countries like Canada and Germany, under our Constitution, the national government, or what we call the federal government, is created by the Constitution, but so are the states, right? The federal government doesn't create the states. They have an independent sort of right to exist under our Constitution. And because of that, each has their own powers, their own responsibilities. And of course, there's lots of tussling and back and forth between the two over our history, over who gets to do what and when and why. And it is common that there's this old Louis Brandeis, who's an associate justice of the Supreme Court, quote about the states as laboratories of democracy, that they get to sort of try out things, and they try things and they fail, and if they succeed, maybe that's great, and then other states do it, and then eventually maybe the federal government makes it national, and that's the sort of the bright and cheery version of sort of the laboratories of democracy when it works great. But in the case of cannabis, what you have is the federal government says this thing is banned. And then starting in 1996, the states start developing programs to enable access to this product, to cannabis. And, an entire industry forms, legal, at least state legal industry. And states are still doing that in defiance of federal law. And so that's still what we see today. In terms of the future, there's been under the Biden administration, there was the effort to consider rescheduling cannabis, moving it from the most restrictive category of 1 down to a less restrictive category of 3. It would make research a little bit easier. It would reduce some of the other industry burdens about like taxes and things like that, but it would not actually make all these state systems legal.
It won't.
Overnight. The point is that even if Schedule 3 happens, and there's a lot of questions right now of what the Trump administration will do with rescheduling, it doesn't mean that overnight these state programs are legal. They're not, because they're selling cannabis that's not approved by the FDA.
Right.
And so even with that change, without the federal government just fully, pulling cannabis off the list and saying that, whatever, it's not banned anymore. Really the future of this policy, and this is what we talk about a lot, is still in the states, right? And the future of the industry is really still in the states. And the federal government has done very little with all the sort of upward pressure of public opinion, and like something like 75% of Americans live in a state where they have legal access to some form of cannabis, medical, mostly, but now it's over half have access to adult use recreational. The federal government has passed one bill, and it was about making research a little easier. And that was in 2022. Beyond that, they've just been unable to do much else.
How can the federal government reckon with this stance that there's no medicinal value when you have the Schaefer report, you have the LaGuardia report, and also the US government having a patent on a strain of cannabis? How can we reckon with this kind of misalignment with what they've shown in the past, what we know exists in the federal zeitgeist, and how it's currently being regulated and legislated on right now?
I'll start with politics, right? Politics helps explain why cannabis is Schedule 1, why that Schaefer report didn't result in cannabis being rescheduled. And of course, the Schaefer report, the Schaefer Commission was required under the CSA to study cannabis and whether it should be on Schedule 1. It was put there temporarily. But then, of course, the Nixon administration just sort of shoved it aside. And you had other changes going on at the state level, but eventually you had a doubling down and expansion of the war on drugs in the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, et cetera. So, politics is clearly important. But also, as the policy and the industry has matured at the state level, it's made some of the federal debates even more complicated, because there are very specific things that federal prohibition, specific problems that it causes for the industry, like banking, for instance, is a classic one, because the federal government regulates banks. And there's money laundering laws and things like that that target illegal drug operations. And of course, any state legal operation is technically illegal federally. The cannabis industry is largely unbanked. So there's lots of stories of having big safes on site and cash trucks traveling from state to state to support companies that have dispensary locations in multiple states, things like that, and also break-ins and thefts, and et cetera. It's because cannabis is largely an unbanked industry, so it's like an all-cash industry. So there have been proposals to fix those specific problems, even without getting rid of prohibition completely. But there's also proposals to reimagine federal policy, whether that's moving cannabis down the schedule to a less restrictive category. There's 5 different levels on federal scheduling, or pulling it out altogether and just letting the states decide, or treating it more like alcohol, and regulating it that way. But any of those broader conversations, they bring in all these more specific issues like, I mean, banking is one, but social equity, addressing the harms of the war on drugs, especially on communities of color in the U.S. It's, there's a whole host of issues that come along with those bigger changes, and that has made it hard for anything to move forward politically in Congress. Even though you have something like 70% or 75% of Americans are living in a state that has at least a comprehensive recreational program, or I'm sorry, comprehensive medical program, and over half are in a state that has adult use recreational. So there's a lot of political pressure up on the federal government, but cannabis policy, as the industry has matured, is complicated, and it's been hard to get traction on anything. There's lots of proposals in Congress, but nothing has been able to move.
Yeah.
What patterns have you observed in how, say, research regulations spread among the states, or any cannabis policies that have spread among the states? And then that spread or diffusion, as is referred to, do you think it might impact researchers working across, say, different jurisdictions, different states?
Sure, yes. So when we look at the early states, California went out first in 1996 and through a ballot initiative. And voters approved it, even though every major state leader, everyone really with a seat at the table, the Clinton administration, all of the federal leaders opposed that law and wanted to stand in the way of it. But the voters still were allowed to do that. So one major element of policy diffusion is, what institutions do you have in your state that allow you to adopt policy? And what we saw early on is that the vast majority of the early adopters were either very liberal states like a Hawaii, so a Democratic state of 65%, something around there, or they had the ballot initiative, which would allow organizations which were pretty new at this time. Like, well, NORML's been around for forever. I'm not sure when Marijuana Policy Project, Americans for Safe Access came online, but they could champion these policies. You had certain leaders within states that worked in advocacy in different ways that led to this diffusion. So early on, federal government is completely against it, and most states that adopt are using the ballot initiative. They're getting around their legislature. What we've seen in latter adoptions, and I kind of consider the line of demarcation that 96 to the end of Bush and then Obama to present as kind of the two major eras, is that more legislatures are willing to take it on. And especially with Obama, and he directed his Department of Justice in a few key ways to not prioritize medical cannabis. And essentially in this memo written by, was it the Ogden memo? Cole was later. Yeah. So the Ogden memo, which was he was a deputy attorney general. It basically said, in a well-regulated system, we're not going to interfere. And that made the states all start to think about how they're regulating cannabis. And that's really when you see the rise of the dispensaries as we know them today, the rise of this large industry. And, of course, it's just a few years preceding the beginning of recreational adoptions, which start with Colorado and Washington in 12, I believe. So now what we see is that each state, I think, is at a new starting point, and they have model bills, model legislation that is, brought to them, from organizations like Marijuana Policy Project, Americans for Safe Access, et cetera. And they also, now you have the industry, with the seat at the table as well. And those are pros and cons to that, right? But what we now see is that states are starting with far more detailed laws, far more regulations, everything from the spaces of the industry to how cannabis can be dispensed, how it can be packaged, et cetera. So that is all relatively new, and then I think the only other thing I would say, so you have these interest groups at the table, but you also have these multi-state actors now that have dispensaries in 10, 12, 15 states, and they're certainly interested when the legislature is taking up this bill.
Right.
I think one of our concerns probably moving forward is related to that. One is, are we going to ultimately end up with just big canna and nothing really underneath for entrepreneurs? And then I think also, I know Dan and I have been talking about this kind of as we're thinking about our second book. Is medical just a gateway policy? Is the goal just adult use recreational, right? And so are there people getting into the medical spaces maybe in bad faith? We're just going to make enough money to keep the lights on, but the goal is to really start selling when we have recreational. And then what happens to those medical patients is,
Correct.
we don't really know or care, right? So I think that's one of the big concerns as we think about moving forward, which is why partly why I feel like Dan and I have been looking at marijuana policy since about 2013, 2014.
Wow.
And there's this air of inevitability, and we're still at like almost the exact same spot. And I think part of that is because as it gets more complicated, there are more people at the table saying, well, wait a minute, you can't move forward and not think about social equity. You can't move forward and not think about the legacy of the war on drugs. You can't move forward and not think about, the opioid epidemic and how that intersects with this. And so there's so many different elements that are coming into play that make it really challenging for the federal government to move.
So what can states do to encourage and enable cannabis research within their regulatory bodies and within their budgets and legislative processes?
I think one arena where there really needs to be more work on this, and this really brings the clinical and the political together, is in physician education. One thing that we're really seeing, normally physicians, they have to register. They have to have a certificate to recommend. They can't prescribe. They can recommend that you try medical cannabis. What we found is that physicians, for understandable reasons, are reluctant to go through that process and that training. Some are very skeptical. Some think this is pseudoscience, and others are just risk averse, perhaps. But it has created a bit of this like two-tier system, which I think has slowed down what we understand as well, where you've kind of had this little niche industry come up of physicians who are who are basically meeting with patients in the interest of getting a medical marijuana card, right? And it's like a test you can't fail. And so you'll have somebody who will have a doctor who they meet on Zoom one time to get that medical card for 1 or 2 years. And then they have a physician that does everything else in their life. And they may not even be honest about that they're using medical cannabis or experimenting with that for fear of backlash, of that being reported and everything else. And so the stigma is not just in the general public, it's not just in the political rhetoric, it's also in the medical field. And we've talked with physicians, even branches of medicine have varying views of how this is and is not good science or has potential. But I do think that's an area where, and again, it may be about which states really care about medical access versus those who passed a law to get the voters off their backs. But to the extent that legislators believe in it and they can pass that down to the bureaucracy and those departments of health to say, like, this is something we should give a good faith effort to understanding and mastering. And instead, I feel like it is treated as like there's still just so much stigma around even getting a certificate to recommend. I feel like the last I looked, there were several hundred doctors in Ohio that have CTRs, a population of 11 million. And so, clearly there's a major disconnect. And again, if I'm getting medical care from a physician and getting my medical ID from someone else, I mean, like, we're not really talking about a whole person and their
Right.
whole health care. We're separating those two elements.
Dr. Mallinson, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was going to say, and there's been some attention to this about how, I mean, a lot of that starts in medical school, right? You think about how physicians are trained. They're trained that these drugs are harmful, that, you want to get your patients off of them if they're on them and things like that. And then maybe that physician then goes and works in a state like Pennsylvania or Ohio that has a medical program. And now they have patients coming to them that, have say in Pennsylvania, anxiety has been very controversial as one of the qualifying conditions. It's now the single largest condition that's claimed. And there's actually some blowback against that in the state, because it's sort of seen as this, as if you have some anxiety, you can get medical marijuana. It's seen as a doorway to recreational use. So it's become very controversial here.
If the med school culture changes,
Yes.
that would be kind of the most immediate way to start changing physician attitudes.
Yeah. So, physicians would need to be trained in medical school. I mean, trained for both realities, right? That drugs do have harmful effects on people, including cannabis. But at least in terms of cannabis, but also now, I mean, what you're seeing with psychedelics, and the research in psychedelics that even the federal government is supporting, a much more complicated or nuanced picture for physicians is being called for in medical schools than just sort of the old just say no messaging.
What would you say to the clinicians who are in the pursuit of, say, research in medical cannabis?
I mean, I think one would be, I mean, this is kind of silly, but there is kind of a like, take your time in terms of understand that whatever brilliant ideas you have, the government is going to move at the government's pace. And so I do think that affects how you need to think about a research agenda, how you need to think about constructing grants or, whatever else it may be. And I think also, like, as we've seen in several arenas, we might be in a bit of like a mini backlash. It felt inevitable. It's made it on the Democrats' national platform as like, we're going to legalize recreational marijuana. If you think of the 2020 debates, that was a pretty universal position. Yeah. And now we're looking at a second Trump administration. And while I don't think he cares too much about cannabis, or that's not a priority, the attorney general, the incoming DEA head, none of those give you hope for this to not be a backlash, right? And even RFK, who will have some oversight as HHS, used to have a very progressive, forward position on legalizing marijuana. And I think because he's trying to play nice with other Republicans, he has now said, well, these states do give us a nice place to kind of, observe what's happening, as if these studies didn't just happen through the DEA review. And he's also, said that it can have, I can't remember the exact wording, but something like it can have devastating consequences. And so I think you just have to realize, and it's probably why this space, there's a number of reasons why research is limited that we've kind of outlined, but one of them is it's fairly precarious, up until there's true overhaul of the CSA and, true all hands on deck focus on fixing medical research. It's just going to come in fits and starts. And a study that seems brilliant and it seems like it has everything that you would need to move forward can just be, cast aside, right? So I think that's just something and it stinks, because I think we want this research really badly and we need this research
desperately.
Yes, but also, people whose full-time job is to conduct medical research, I understand how at some point the grant money isn't there, the institutional support isn't there, and they have to move into other places to kind of keep their lab going, right? So I think that's a real challenge. And we talk about so many of these just catch-22s with the policy, right? Part of of the rescheduling debate is like, well, we don't have the medical research to justify it. Well, of course we don't, because you don't let us do it. So that is a major issue. And Dan, you may have some other things to add for future researchers.
Well, I had two things. So one is I think Lee's right, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the current moment about what the Trump administration is going to do. But it's also good to remember when Trump came in the first time, he picked Jeff Sessions as his as Attorney General, and Sessions is a hardcore prohibitionist. And even Trump made fun of him, saying he sounded like his granddad from the
from the
1950s or whatever.
50s.
So that's really good. So and Trump during the election said he was going to vote for the legalization initiative in Florida, since he's a Florida resident now. And so, I mean, clearly he can put people in place that, either slow walk or kill maybe the current scheduling effort. But if you listen to people who've been the real cannabis insiders that are way more inside than we are about that whole process, even just having HHS recommend rescheduling is a huge win, because it means the federal government has admitted that marijuana has medicinal value. And so the government has made that admission. And so you can't really, it's hard to walk completely back from that, right? Even if it just means that things are stalled for 4 years. I mean, we saw this. There was a push to open up NIDA to more marijuana suppliers to get over this problem with the University of Mississippi during the late Obama administration. It stalled out during Trump, and then it got finished during Biden. And so you may see those things happen again. So I think it's good to remember that. The one other thing, though, for clinicians that I've heard about people who are trying to get into this area of research, especially if you're in an institution that has not had cannabis research at it before, is that you have to really be an educator. You have to really educate your IRB, your institutional review board, and those other administrators probably about the value of the research, and that they don't have to be afraid of the university having infrastructure to do this research. I have heard that suggestion for folks doing clinical research in this area, that a big part of the early stages are educating your own institution about that this research is legitimate, it's important, it can be done, and that they should support it with the infrastructure.
What are some of the greatest barriers to cannabis research from a policy perspective that you've seen? And with that being said, what potential solutions do you see as ideal, and why?
So I think the largest is that even though states have started to set up their own research enterprises, schools and other research centers have tried to support some of this medical research. The actual research process still involves going through through NIDA, going through the FDA, the DEA, the State Department of Health, the Institutional Review Board, and so
I'm tired just hearing the list.
yeah. So if I said today that I have this great idea for starting a some type of clinical trial, it might be 2-3 years, and who knows what types of costs are added, and what types of extra provisions come in, all the ways I might be pushed and pulled to where when I finally get to that study, I don't even know if I believe that the results will matter, right? And we've also discussed how the actual product being studied is not the research available marijuana is not in line with what states are producing. And that was even picked up on by there were some representatives, Dave Joyce and Scott Peters, who are both activists for improving marijuana and getting the federal government out of the way. They have this line in this memo they wrote last year where they said in California, you can walk into a store and legally purchase a marijuana gummy to help you fall asleep. But a researcher can't buy that same gummy to analyze its short and long-term benefits and risk. And I think that in a nutshell is capturing the issue that we have. So even if we discover that what I've heard anecdotally, this kind of low quality cannabis from the University of Mississippi, even if we see that it has some effect, positive or negative. We're not exactly sure how that generalizes to this broader space where there are oils and tinctures and creams and vaporized cannabis and smoked cannabis and flower and all of this. And so that has been one of the, I think, one of the major issues. As far as best practices or, moving forward, what we have seen is more observational studies, surveys of medical users. We've seen some inferential studies where you'll look at some outcome at the state level, like opioid overdoses, and you'll compare states that do and do not have cannabis, medical cannabis, and see if there are differences. So you can imagine that that is very hard to control for a lot of confounders
Right.
as you do that type of research. Um, a recent one I saw that I did think was really interesting was in psychological medicine last year, and what they used identical twin sibling pairs, a sample of about 4,500 sibling pairs, and there, what you do is you control for a lot of that internal those internal factors that predict addiction and predict other mental health, physical health outcomes. And then they controlled for those that were in states with access to medical cannabis and those without. And interestingly, they found that people in states with legal cannabis did use it more than their twin pair elsewhere. But they also found that they were no more likely to suffer any mental, physical, relationship, or financial problems because of it. So those are some interesting kind of forward steps that I think we're seeing with cannabis policy, but it creates a need for far more creativity than most research design ask for, because either you have to go through the very costly, very inefficient, and very tenuous clinical trials process, or you try to find these other creative ways to identify differences, and then probably in the review process somebody complains that why aren't you doing clinical trials, right?
Right.
So so it is a real challenge for clinicians, and something that I think they need to be very aware of as they go forward.
Well, I mean, one other big thing is money. The federal government is the big player in funding medical research, at least for now. We'll see what happens with the NIH and everything going on at the NIH. But at least in terms of cannabis studies that they fund, it's largely studies that are about the harms of cannabis. And there are some stories out there of researchers who are interested in the therapeutic effects, but have sort of framed their studies in a way that it was about harms, and they were able to get funding, and then they were able to publish on therapeutic effects as sort of a secondary outcome. But of course, that's not what you would want. If what you really care about are therapeutic effects, you want to directly study and design your study for that.
Right.
But so that makes getting enough money to do this type of research very difficult. But I also think the development of the research programs in the States is important, even though based on our interviews, they're very cautious. They typically don't, like Lee said, allow randomized controlled trials right now, even though in theory, that's the benefit of having the state research programs, is that they could provide state legal cannabis to patients. There's still a reticence to do that. But there is, at least in theory, this alternative structure for doing impactful research.
Yeah, I'll just add, another challenge is because of federal law, every state has to stand up their entire market, seed to sale. So, you can't, when Ohio adopted marijuana, medical marijuana, they couldn't bring in finished product from Michigan to get things going. Everything had to start in the ground in greenhouses in Ohio and move its way up. And so that also means, horticulturalists have to be at the table, to really know, if we're getting everything the same when we're talking about these research agendas as well. And so, yeah, it does make it a much more difficult substance to research than your standard isolated chemical compounds that that we can see exactly how they act. And that lack of understanding is a mix of cannabis just being a very unique plant that I don't know if we'll ever fully get to the bottom of. It's why its properties do what they do. But then also, of course, the fact that they've been shut out of federal research, plays in as well.
One of the last things I wanted to talk about, and you guys kind of touched on it, but what are your thoughts on how the current administration and political landscape will affect cannabis policy and then thus cannabis research?
It's interesting because Trump initially initially put forward Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, and he also put forward someone else for DEA who had a more more hands-off view of cannabis policy, let's say. Of course, we know what happened with Gaetz. That DEA person, they also fell through. They had a position that conservatives didn't want them to have on something. I can't even remember. But now we have two people that are much more prohibitionist in their views. Terrence Cole at DEA, I don't think he's confirmed yet. And then Pam Bondi, who is the confirmed Attorney General. So if we think about the law enforcement perspective, I don't think there's as much signs for hope, right? For people who want to see expansion, ingenuity, innovativeness, it seems like we're going to hear some of the same reservations at best, if not outright skepticism, or even, at some points, there's even people who almost make fun of this as even a real realm worth studying or understanding or caring about. So in that way, we don't know what to expect. And what's interesting is that under Biden, they visited rescheduling, and I believe they got it all the way to comments and hearings through the DEA, and then it keeps getting delayed. Perhaps in an alternate universe, had Harris been elected, that would have played out in December, and she would have come in with an administration with obviously different views on cannabis, and we'd already be there with rescheduling. But this administration has shown a willingness to be very heavy-handed with their priorities, and so in some ways, who cares what the legal process is for scheduling? They could easily just use that logic and shut it down. We don't think Trump himself is where a lot of maybe the median Republican voter or legislator is. But this kind of comes into in political science, we have a whole field on agenda setting. How does something rise up to become priority, to where people want to talk about it, to where it's a major issue, to where it finally gets onto the legislative calendar. Right. And that's where cannabis often just falls off the agenda, because we have more salient debates over healthcare and immigration and homeland security and international affairs. And so what we may see is just stasis for a few years, and perhaps that upward pressure will finally meet the right administration with also like the right agenda. But it does seem like we've seen so many places these kind of false horizons where it's like, this is it. This person got elected. This is their platform. This is their position. This is their attorney general. And again, it's not that they don't care, but in the grand scheme of just accomplishing political tasks, getting Congress on board, getting public opinion on board and everything else, it often falls to the side for other priorities. And the irony is, the longer we take to sort it out, the more complicated it becomes. So every year you have new people whose everything from people's healthcare and their livelihood to people's business and their livelihood are just kind of left in this middle gray area where there just isn't movement from the federal government, especially.
I will point out, so you mentioned Gates. I think somebody else to watch now in Congress, as it relates to this discussion, is Nancy Mace. So she's a representative Republican from South Carolina. she has introduced one of the Republican marijuana reform bills that would decriminalize marijuana and essentially, basically hand it over to the states to decide what they want to do. She is very loyal to Trump. Trump speaks very favorably of her. And so I could imagine, to the extent that this gets on the agenda, that she would be a voice in his ear on this issue. Now, what that means, policy wise, I don't know, but it has been a major issue that she's been driving in Congress. It's been one of her major issues that she's been trying to drive in Congress from a Republican, standpoint, right? So now again, we get back into how complex things are. Is it a bill that's going to get a lot of Democrats? Does it have strong social equity components? That kind of stuff. No. Restorative justice. No. So you're going to lose Democrats like Cory Booker in the Senate, things like that. But in terms of a voice on this policy, she's probably somebody to watch during a Trump administration.
Mhm.
Any last thoughts that you wanted to share with us, or anything that you want to plug?
Sure. Well, I mean, we'll certainly plug Green Rush from NYU Press. So that is out, and the paperback is not super expensive. I think it's like $30 for the paperback, so it's not bad for a book. From an academic press. We are, as I think it came up earlier, Lee mentioned, we are working on a second book with Johns Hopkins University Press. That one is much more, our first book is more policy theory driven and heavy, and about federalism, things like that. The second book is much more interview driven. So I think we've mentioned a few times, we've talked to this person, talked to that person. That's really the foundation for that book. And it's going to be about sort of the strategy of going after medical marijuana first, and paving the way for adult use recreational, but also how the sort of incomplete medicalization of marijuana. A lot of things that we talked about, about research and what we do and don't understand, how patients are treated, things like that, the doctor-patient relationship, stigma, how that affects the programs and the patients and the other players. So that will hopefully be coming out, as books go, probably not until late next year, but
We'll be here
Excited for that.
before
We'll have
you
to
know
have
it.
you both back on the show to talk about the book.
Love
Yeah.
that for sure. I'll just add, as Dan said, I think our main contribution and story in that book was that the states is where the action has been. And I think just watching kind of people who follow marijuana closely, marijuana policy, like that subculture, are often following every little thing that comes out of Washington. And I do think being more wide read on what's happening in the states, both for what may ultimately be taken up by the federal government if they move, but then also that is where this policy moves forward, right? I mean, we're talking about dispensaries and money and hundreds of thousands of patients and all of that, in spite of the federal government not doing a thing. And so I think, there is really good, I really like what Marijuana Moment does. They're reporting on this space. Politico has excellent cannabis reporters, Paul Demko, Natalie Fertig, Mona Zahn. So I would watch some of those spaces and just become acquainted with the states. You can start by reading our book, and then go from there. But I think that, especially with our conversation about where we see this second Trump administration, my guess is the states will continue to position and tinker and improve policies and research and everything else. And we'll see what changes in 28 or 32 or further down the line.
So, gentlemen, again, I thank you both for jumping in
Mhm.
and helping me, kind of pick through I feel like it's a tangled necklace of sorts, if
Yes.
have a really tight knot in it. So
Mhm.
I really, really thank you guys because you've set us up, really well.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Well, everyone, that concludes our show for today. We hope you've enjoyed the content. I'm your co-host, LaKeysha Moton,
And I'm Arnelle Etienne.
and we will see you guys next time. Feel free to check out the show notes and the resource links.